in the EDP newsrooms in the heart of Norwich for the first of two special election programmes, and I'm joined by the candidates from the Norwich North constituency. I'll introduce you to them all in a moment. And whether you're watching us on Mustard TV, you might be watching us on Facebook, or you might be watching us on YouTube, we hope that today we're going to be able to answer some of your questions that'll help you decide who to vote for in this election. So, the candidates from the Norwich North constituency. For the Green Party, we have Adrian Holmes. For the Conservatives, Chloe Smith. From Labour, Chris Jones. And for the Liberal Democrats, we have Hugh Lanham. So, let's start straight away with some of our audience questions. And Rob Setchell from Mustard TV's news team is in the audience. Let's have our first question from you.
OK, I think we've got Wendy Howes first to start us off. Wendy.
Can you convince me that you are committed to honouring the people's vote and wholeheartedly supporting the Brexit process?
All right, let's start with Chloe Smith.
Thank you. Well, thank you, and Wendy, thank you for your question. Yes, I am wholeheartedly committed to that process, and as is my party. The country voted last year. It was certainly close, but it was a clear result, and that has to be upheld. We in the Conservative Party want to make a great success out of that. Theresa May is standing to be the leader that can do that negotiation, which is now required. And let's not forget that only 11 days after polling day is the beginning of those negotiations. So we need a good leader in place, ready to go for that. In the Conservative Party, we would like to see a good deal on Brexit, which I think in turn will become a good deal for us here in Norwich by bringing more jobs and opportunities right back home here for people.
OK, let's hear from Chris Jones. Is Jeremy Corbyn the right man to conduct these negotiations?
Yes, I think he is, and yes, the Labour Party is committed to implementing the decision of the referendum into Brexit. I think we've made that decision now. What we haven't decided yet is what sort of Brexit and what sort of country we're going to have after we've left the EU. And I think there are two very different visions of Britain's future on offer in this election. Labour is offering a positive, outward-looking Britain that will remain engaged with Europe and with the rest of the world, that will be on good terms with Europe, that will continue to trade with Europe, that will keep many of the consumer and employment and environmental protections that we've had through Europe, but we'll do that as an independent country outside of the EU. And I think on the other side we're hearing about a hard Brexit, where we're going to be inward looking, where we're not going to have a positive relationship with the rest of the world, that will do an awful lot of damage to this country in the future. So yes, committed to Brexit, but we have to make a decision next week about what sort of Brexit we want to see. OK,
let's hear from Hugh Lanham. The question was, are you committed, thank you, are you committed to honouring the people's vote wholeheartedly to support Brexit?
One respects the people's vote, but the vote was not very clear. We are committed to going through with the negotiations to put then in front of the people the package that we've managed to negotiate. And if it is not good enough, and if the people do not think that it is good enough, then we would go back into the EU.
OK, let's hear from Adrian Holmes then. Where does the Green Party stand on Brexit?
Yes, well, I voted for Remain, and the Green Party were recommending people voted to remain in Europe.
But will you honour the people's vote?
I will honour the people's vote, and we're going to actually push for a Brexit, which doesn't mean that all the EU nationals working in Norwich, particularly at the university, a large number of EU nationals who are in the research department doing a great job for Norwich, we want them to be guaranteed residence here, and that's the first thing we want this government to do before we go into any detailed negotiations. Make sure people, EU nationals living in Norwich, are secure. Now, when it comes to the end of the negotiations, we're not going to accept a complete withdrawal from Europe without, for instance, being part of the freedom of movement and also a single market. Those are kind of key points that we want maintained. So we will offer the people of the UK a referendum on that deal as presented to us by the government. And as part of that, we will say if you're not interested or if it's not satisfactory, then we will remain in the EU.
Okay.
But that will be a choice of people in another referendum.
I want to come back to EU citizens in a moment, but what about the free market? Should we stay in? Let's start over this end. Should we stay in the free market?
Absolutely. I mean, all the predictions are that we lose huge amounts of trade if we come out of the free market. Why do it? why shoot ourselves in the foot? It was a wonderful thing that we've built over the last 40 years, which has made us much wealthier.
Okay, so very briefly, should we stay in the single market?
Yes, I think we should. We're a trading nation. We live and die through our trading relationships, and that's vitally important to us. There are several countries who are not in the EU, who are part of the single market. There's no reason why we can't be the same. And the referendum last year was not about the single market. It was about whether or not we stay in the EU. So they're two different questions.
Let's have a word from Chloe Smith on the single market. Are we going to stay in, or...?
Well, if I may, the answer we've just heard there shows why Jeremy Corbyn's candidate isn't the man for this job, because you can't be a member of the EU and, you can't not be a member of the EU and remain in the single market. These things come together. Theresa May has answered this question very honestly, so the answer from the Conservatives is that we are going to have to leave the single market because the referendum last year is asking us to leave the EU. These things come together. Now, what we want to do instead is to negotiate even more effective trade deals around the whole world.
Okay, you're shaking your head. A very brief word from Hugh.
I'm just not convinced that they are inseparable issues.
Okay, all right. Let's go back to Rob Setchell. I think you've got another question also on the EU and on Brexit.
Yeah, we're coming to Lewis Martin now.
Oh, hello. My question is, what are the candidates' opinions on ensuring the rights of EU citizens that currently reside in the UK? As you've heard today, UEA has requested that EU citizens' rights are retained, with 1 in 10 members of staff there being EU citizens, as well as thinking about the wider Norfolk community, which is heavily reliant upon EU labour.
Okay, let's start with Chris Jones this time.
Okay, well, I think guaranteeing the rights of EU citizens is a fundamental and a vital issue. It's one of the things that we have said we would do before the negotiations start. We would make it clear that that was going to be our position, and there are several reasons for that. It's the right thing to do for our country because we rely on a lot of these people, as we've heard, at the UEA, in the NHS, in many of our industries. These are vital people, and there's a real risk that they are already starting to move away because they don't have any security of their future. It's the right thing to do for the negotiations because we also need to negotiate the rights of British citizens in the rest of the EU, and so having some reciprocity there is going to be important, and we need to get that principle clear from the outset. So yes, we would guarantee those rights.
Okay, Hugh Lanham.
I think it's absolutely awful that we're even thinking about using people as bargaining chips. The people who are here, working here, and doing a jolly good job for us, and the health service and at the UEA and all sorts of other places, are people. Yes, we're shooting ourselves in the foot, and I know I've used that term already, but we're shooting ourselves in the foot by unsettling them and putting them at risk of having to go home. But we've got to deal with people like we're decent human beings ourselves.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk to... Let's hear from Adrian Holmes. I know you've mentioned this already, but this is a tricky thing that Theresa May is going to have to grapple with, and in terms of Brits abroad as well as EU citizens here.
That's right, but what I want her to do, assuming that she gets back in, or whoever is elected, is to make sure that, as the leader, to make sure that we have that clear, that EU citizens are safe here before we go to the final Brexit negotiation. I mean, the fact is, we've got people working from the EU in Norwich. They're paying taxes, they're doing a valuable job for our economy, and we're putting their livelihoods, we're putting their futures at risk, but also our own futures, because we're relying on them in the NHS and in our universities to help us, generate those jobs in the economy.
Okay, so the question was, what are the candidates' opinions on ensuring the rights of EU citizens that currently reside here? Chloe Smith.
Well, thank you, and Lewis, thank you for the question. It is a very important one, and I agree with you being here to raise it. And as others have said, this is a very, very important thing that must be done as early as possible as a priority. The Conservatives have set out that they will do exactly that. Theresa May has said this is one of her earliest priorities in negotiations. But in answer to the debate point of whether it could have been done even sooner, if you like, whether it can be done outside of negotiations, sadly, the answer to that is already no. Theresa May tried to do that because she feels, as strongly as we all do, that this is an important thing to settle. But Jean-Claude Juncker and Angela Merkel and others in Europe said, no, we're not going to be able to deal with that soon. We're going to have to do it in negotiations. So, if you like, the argument for the unilateral settling of this doesn't carry any water. You can't do it. Also, what Theresa May is setting out to do is to be able to give certainty to those Britons who also live in the other EU countries. The duty of a government is to look after its own citizens, as well as to be as good as possible to citizens of other countries who are involved with us. And if I may, one final point. In my experience as a constituency MP, I've spent time talking to the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital and to others to understand what the workforce concern there might be. And let's not forget that, in fact, this is not only a question about European nationals who work at our hospital there or in the NHS. In our particular case, we also have a great community here from the Philippines, as an example. And that comprises quite a number of people who are already actually happily working in this country without having had to be anything to do with the EU. So this question, in terms of our NHS workforce, is not actually the be-all or end-all that some people might suggest it is.
Okay, all right, thank you. Let's go back to Rob Setchell in the audience.
Yeah, no, there's lots of you watching on Facebook tonight, and some interesting input on there on that question. Tom Garrod says, as Chloe's just raised, mustn't we guarantee the rights of UK citizens living abroad at the same time as we guarantee the rights of EU citizens here? Which is a valid point, but what they want to know is how. How are you going to guarantee those rights? It's very important that we are. How?
Yes, go first, Steve.
Of course. Sure. Well, Tom, thank you for the question through Rob there. This will have to be done as a matter of negotiation. So I'm sure in our debate right here today, there will be 20 things we talk about that must be done and we say how. And all of these will have to be done in the negotiations. Now, I can't give Tom or any other watcher the precise instruction manual for that, but what I can say is that you need to pick the leader whose judgment you can trust to go and do that for us. And let's not forget, these negotiations start 11 days after polling day. This is a crucial question, and you need a good leader for it.
Let's ask Chris Jones to respond to that.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right, but of course Chloe Smith then has got the wrong answer to that. We, as the UK, can't guarantee what the European Union will agree to in negotiations, so clearly we can't speak for them. We have to negotiate that. Sadly, Theresa May has already said that her approach to those negotiations would be to be as difficult and awkward as possible. I don't think that's the way you're going to get a good deal. And if it was Labour in power running those negotiations, we would have a much more consensual and cooperative approach to our European partners, trying to come to an agreement that was good for everybody, not going straight in, all guns blazing in confrontation. Just to answer Chloe's previous point, it is right that the bilateral agreements are going to have to wait for the negotiations to start, but there was absolutely nothing stopping the British government making clear that its position would be to guarantee the right of EU's nationals in this country. They could have done that 11 and a half months ago. They waited a year not doing that, and that has not only made that negotiating relationship more difficult, we've already seen a significant exodus of people in the NHS. I've seen that where I've worked, and from places like the UEA and from a lot of industries, already people leaving, recruitment getting harder because people have not been given that certainty. They could have done that.
Hugh Lanham, the Liberal Democrats found themselves in coalition before. If it happened again, how do you think Tim Farron would deal with this situation?
Well, I think he would, again, be a much more consensual negotiator.
But is that what we need?
Consensus? Yes, of course it's what we need. Just being confrontational has got us into this position where we couldn't even deal with that piece of negotiation before
Before it begins?
Before it begins, exactly.
Okay.
So.
Let's move on to some local issues now. So Susan Wright's got a question for us. Susan?
I'd like to direct this, first of all, to Chloe Smith. How is the increased use of food banks in this country a reflection on a strong and stable government?
Okay. So, concerned about the use of food banks, how is it a reflection on strong and stable government?
Well, it's first of all a pleasure to hear from Susan, who I've corresponded with as a local MP, and it's great to see the local Labour Party is alive and well in this corner of the audience. What I would say in answer to the question... Well, I shall answer Susan. What I would, in all seriousness, let's go to the question, because it is a very important one. What the Conservative Party has done for this country is to ensure that there are more people in work. We have a strong economy which has record levels of employment, in which 3/4 of that rise of employment has been in full-time work, for example, and in good quality jobs. We would like to continue doing so, And what we are seeking to do is to make people better off in work than on welfare. Now, there are people who use food banks, and I say this carefully because, in fact, the use of food banks has been there under Labour governments as well. This is not a new phenomenon. However, it is something that we need to be very, very mindful of, and we need to be able to make sure people can make their living in work and care for their families. That is what the Conservative Party's manifesto full of policies is geared towards.
Okay, let's hear from Adrian Holmes. What would you do about the problem of increasing numbers of people needing to use food banks? How would the Greens tackle it?
Well, for a start off, we've got child poverty levels in Norwich North approaching 40% in some areas. We've got to restore benefit cuts. Austerity is hitting hard those people least able to cope with it. I read a statistic today where I think there's 3,500 children living in 2,200 families that are actually in serious debt.
So what would you do?
Well, what we've got to do is we've got to invest in public services, create jobs, put money back into the NHS, back into local services, restore the cuts in children's services and adult services at the local county level.
Can it be afforded?
It can be afforded, yes, because we said we're going to tax the rich, if you like. We're going to put up the top level of tax to 60%. We're going to restore the corporation tax cuts, and we're going to invest those in public services, and at the same time as creating green jobs by a 50 billion investment in Warmer Homes initiative, which will actually take people out of fuel poverty. We've guaranteed that, and we've put the costings up, and we've invited people to challenge us on it. The second point, I think, is also that we've got a government that is concentrating totally on the public debt. So, for instance, when we had the crash of 2008, the government, through the Bank of England, put 425 billion in what was called quantitative easing. Now, if a fraction of that money had been put into, say, the schools programme, they wouldn't have had to cut the schools programme by by 500 million when they came into power. These are the kind of choices a government has to make. How are they going to spend money, and are they going to do it for the benefit of everybody in society, the poorest particularly? And that's where we want to put the emphasis, the main thrust of our policies.
Okay, let's hear from Hugh Lanham. Hugh Lanham, the Liberal Democrats were in coalition with the Conservatives around the time that we were talking about problems with food banks. Is there anything you could have done that would have made the situation better? Is there anything that you would do now?
Well, I think that we were doing things to help anyway. The idea that austerity was going to solve all our problems, we knew was wrong, and we were fighting against it, and it needed to have been stopped much, much sooner. The problem with austerity is it slows down the economy. It stops growth or slows down growth.
But the Liberal Democrats were on board with that when you were in coalition.
We were very much mitigating the efforts of our Tory partners in that, but there was still too much austerity. I freely accept, and we know it doesn't really work. It causes more problems than it solves, and yet we stick with it. Perhaps there's strength and stability, I don't know.
And what would you do differently now?
We have to release the economy. We have to release the caps on wages in the public sector. We have to sort some of these cruel benefit cuts and get people back to something approaching a dignified way of life. Having to go to food banks is an awful thing to make people do.
Okay, let's have a quick response from Chloe, and then I'll come to Chris for a more detail. A quick response to some of those points, quite critical of the Conservatives.
Well, what we're seeing from the panel here so far is to wish to bend over backwards in the Brexit negotiations from here, and to not focus on the public debt from here, and to have uncapped welfare, which no doubt Chris will argue for next. That is what you're seeing from the rest of the panel. The Conservatives make no apology for wanting to get the best deal for Britain, to control our public finances, to help people into work rather than onto welfare, and to make work pay more than it does to be on welfare.
Okay, let's hear from Chris Jones.
Okay, well, the the unprecedented increase in the use of food banks over the last 10 years is absolutely an indictment of a society that is not working for an awful lot of people. And it shows the growing inequality in our society, and it shows the lack of concern that both the coalition and the current government have had for people struggling to get by. And we're also seeing now, of course, that a lot of that increase is actually people who are in work and still relying on food banks, and that is a real scandal, and that is a terrible reflection on the sort of society that we are building. We know that there are Conservative MPs who will say that the use of food banks is nothing to do with poverty, it's all about people's cash flow problems. Well, I'll tell you what, so I think Sir Philip Green had some cash flow problems, but I don't think you're going to see him down at the local food bank anytime soon. So we do need to change that, and we do need to rebalance not just our economy but our society so that it is fairer for everybody and so that nobody gets left behind.
But are your plans affordable, though?
Yes, we're the only party that's come out with a fully costed manifesto. We've shown in very much detail, 250 pages of detail, where all of the money is coming from.
You still haven't answered the £58 billion black hole in all of your 250 pages.
There is...
Where are your costings? Where are your costings?
All right, okay, thank you.
Yeah, my costings are under the table.
Thank you very much. Let's carry on.
There is no black hole, as every government does. We have made projections in terms of what economic growth will be and what the cash flow of the government will be.
It'll be dependent on the number of taxpayers, higher rate taxpayers, presumably.
As every forecast and every prediction over a 5-year period is going to be, but we have produced these very rigorously costed and very rigorously argued evidence of where that money balances from. So we have fully costed it. And in answer to the food bank question, we would be raising the minimum wage. We would be reversing some of the benefit cuts for the least well-off and the most disadvantaged people and the most vulnerable people in our society. And we would be building a fairer and a better society for everyone.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, let's go back to Rob in the audience with another question.
Yeah, there's some interesting points on Facebook again coming in on this. Mike Crome says more people in work, question mark, on 0-hour contracts. Is a point that's being raised to us, and stagnated wages. So I think the question that they're raising there is, how are we getting more people into work? And when we get them into work, is it sustainable work that continues?
May I come in on that? This is something that's often said about 0-hour contracts. It is a very small proportion of the country that works on 0-hour contracts. It's in single digits as a percentage of people in work. It's a very, very small number. And I would also say this, for some people, flexible contracts like that really work. And I was speaking to a lady only this week who said it worked great around her child's school hours, just as one example. So I don't think there's a good case for banning 0-hour contracts because they do work for some people. Now, I said in my earlier answer that of that rise in employment, which has been considerable, we have record levels of people in work. 3/4 of that rise has been in full-time jobs, and the Conservative Party wants to particularly use the opportunity of Brexit to negotiate that we will get better trade, which brings more jobs right back home here to Norwich.
Okay, I think most people know that the Labour policy on 0 hours contract, but what about the Greens? Would you ban them?
Yes, we would, but also, I mean, what I want to get away from is this idea that, poverty isn't a choice. Poverty is a lack of cash. And people are not there because of their bad character. They're there because they're in unfortunate circumstances. And we need a society that actually recognises that, and not bringing back this idea of the undeserving poor and saying that, if you haven't got a job, then you don't deserve benefits. This is a kind of pernicious, sort of, if you like, storyline that's being sold by the Conservatives all through. And yes, we have to get back. We suggested a basic income, which would be a basic income for everybody. We're not going to introduce it straight away, but we're going to run a funded trial for it, as is being done at the moment in countries like Finland. It's actually being done in the US. You haven't heard about it, but it's been paid for by some Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. But those are the sort of things that we need to get away from, demonising people who are on the lowest level of society, who are just struggling to actually exist at the moment. It's why we've got food banks. It's why, unfortunately, it's going to get worse, because we haven't got the range of jobs being provided anymore due to deindustrialisation. We need to sort of find a different way of securing people, giving them a safety net so they can contribute in their own way to the economy.
Okay, I want to bring in Hugh Lanham. What is the Liberal Democrats saying on 0 hours contracts? Would they be banned under your manifesto?
Yes, we don't want 0 hours contracts. We want people to have proper jobs.
But Chloe says they work for some people.
Yeah, I mean, you can choose your hours in any sort of contractual arrangement.
Well, not if you ban certain types of contracts. That's the point
Well,
about banning things.
Yes, but I mean, if you go with an ordinary contract to your employer and say, I want to work part-time because I want to have these times off, that's fine. And you'll still get your holidays and you'll still get all the other things. And that's the important part of it. The 0 hours things, there's no protection, there's no holiday pay, there's just no safety.
Okay, just a very brief word, Christian.
Yeah, I'll just say it's not just about 0 hours contracts, as was mentioned at the beginning. It's also about people who are underemployed, people who want to have full-time work and can't get it, or want to have more hours work and can't get it. It's also about people who are overqualified for the jobs that they're doing, people who've got qualifications that they're not able to use, and so are working in less skilled jobs. And what we've seen in the last few years is a massive rise in in-work poverty. And it's people who are working who are using food banks, and that is a disgrace.
Okay, thank you very much.
Just quickly, before we move on, we've got Jo in the audience here, and Jo's daughter is on one of these contracts. What's her experience been like, Jo?
She doesn't get any, well, maybe a few days' notice of what hours she has to work the next week. And also, that leads to her not being able to attend the interview for her top-up benefits, because she's on such low wages, and so she gets sanctioned for a benefit sanction for not attending that interview, but she doesn't know what hours she's going to work each week, and this is not good for young people to start their working life like this.
Okay, we should just let Chloe have a brief response.
Well, Jo, thank you for that, and thank you for bringing that piece of experience in. One thing I would say about that is that there are things that you could pick your local MP to try to do about that. So as the constituency MP, I have worked with the Job Centre to bring about a project that has so far helped nearly 2,000 young people into work. You can ask for that kind of action from your candidates here to be your local MP, as well as what you're looking for from the manifestos.
Okay, thank you all very much.
Very briefly, Jo, and then we're going to move on.
I think if you work for a multi-million pound store, a national store, then you've got a huge job to do to tackle those organisations which make enormous profits on the backs of people like my daughter.
Okay, thank you, Jo.
Let's move on, guys, because we've got a limited amount of time. So let's move on to a question from Jan on the NHS. Jan.
Okay.
You're going to want the mic, though.
I will want it, thank you. Do I have to have a Liberal Democrat mic? Only joking.
It's an SNP mic.
Okay, just very quickly, just before I read my question, just to reassure Chloe and everybody else, I don't think you have to be in any political party to be concerned about what the government's policies are doing to disabled, sick and the most vulnerable in our society. In fact, your policies, Chloe, are killing people on disability benefits that you voted to cut last year.
Okay.
But I'll move on to the NHS.
Have your question, yeah.
What will your party do to ensure the NHS is properly staffed and funded if elected? I'm particularly concerned about the privatisation, ongoing privatisation of the NHS. And recently there's been a lot of discussion around the Naylor report, which is about selling off estates that the NHS owns, that Theresa May thinks that's perfectly fine.
All right,
to
thank
do.
you, Jan. Thank you very much. So the question
Thanks,
is,
Jan. A few extras,
what would your party do to ensure the NHS is properly staffed and funded if elected? So let's start this time with Hugh.
Well, the number one thing is we are going to put more money into the NHS. And we're going to do that by putting 1 penny on all rates of income tax, which we think is fair and progressive and will bring about 6 billion in to serve that purpose. I think your question was specifically about staffing.
Staffed and funded.
Staffed and funded, yes. Staffed and funded.
So, I mean, the other thing is that we are very, very concerned about the free movement of people, both within Europe and, you know, there are also now fairly strong barriers against importing, allowing nurses and other people in from non-European countries. So we need to free up the movement of people to allow that to happen.
But isn't that what people voted against when they voted to leave the EU?
I still don't know what they voted against. I cannot believe that people that a number of people at least did not think that they were going to get £350 million a week for the NHS. What we now know is that there's a blooming great hole. There isn't going to be £350 million for the NHS. We're talking about putting extra money on income tax to try and fill that hole. And, you know, did people really vote for that? I am not convinced, which is why we need to go back and have the second referendum when we know what Brexit looks like, and see if people still think the same.
We're drifting back into Brexit, and we've already talked about that quite extensively. Let's hear from Adrian Holmes of the Green Party, and the question was, what would you do to ensure the NHS is properly staffed and funded?
Well, we're going to cancel Trident, and some of that money is going to go into the NHS, but we've got to look at the NHS from the point of view of rolling back the privatisation, getting it back to a public health service. When I stood in Norwich South 10 years ago, it was because I was worried about the PFI contract, which is going to go and build the Norfolk and Norwich. What we have is private owners of a hospital holding the NHS to ransom on doing things like putting in new beds that needed, and all the other investment issues.
It's got to be funded somehow.
Yeah, so by tax, we're going to take some of the money from the corporation tax. We're going to have a wealth tax, which I won't explain now, but it's on the wealthiest people. We're going to do things like tax inheritance on the wealth of the person it's going to, not on who's on the person that's actually giving it. And we're going to find the money because we need to support our National Health Service. But more than anything, we need to get rid of the private sort of monopolies that are going into it, which are actually not helping at all in terms of efficiency or costs. We believe that a properly funded public health service can actually run inside the public sector more efficiently than it can with this current marketisation. So that's got to be a big thing. In terms of training, we need to scrap the tuition fees for nurses, but also we're going to scrap them for everybody going to university. We need to invest in our younger people. Younger people at the moment have got the biggest problem. You know, there's not that many jobs out there. They're having to skill themselves up. We've got to support them, not penalise them, not have them coming out of university with £44,000 debt, which they've got very little chance of paying off before they even start looking for a job. Okay. So we need to make that investment.
All right, thank you. I want to go to Dr. Chris Jones next. Both of these candidates have talked about private finance, but it started under a Labour government, didn't it? So where do we go from here? How will you make sure it's properly staffed and funded in the future?
No, actually, sorry, that's not true. It started under Conservative government. It was Kenneth Clarke who introduced the private finance initiative in, I think it was 95 or 96.
It certainly expanded
so it started
under Labour, didn't it?
We certainly ran some private finance initiative contracts, as have all governments since then, but you did say it started under Labour, and that was not true.
Okay, thank you for the correction.
Can we just acknowledge that?
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Tony Blair, though, who first started using private providers in the NHS.
No, that's not true either. In fact, it was Kenneth Clarke again in 1989 when he was Secretary of State for Health who introduced the purchaser-provider split into the health service and started the privatisation. And I was working in the health service at that time, remember it very well.
Thank you for correcting us. What would the Labour Party do?
We've already heard from two other candidates. It is a lot of this is about funding, and we have said very clearly that we would put extra funding into the NHS, £37 billion over the lifetime of the Parliament. Before Chloe says it, that is also explicitly costed line by line in the manifesto and in the spending plans. We've shown very clearly where that comes from, and we would invest more in our health service. As a country, we still spend less than the European average on healthcare. We spend less than the OECD average on healthcare. So we are a wealthy country who could make the choices to spend more on healthcare if we choose to do that, and we would do that. In terms of staffing, I think there's a number of strands to this. It is partly about making Britain an attractive place for the overseas workforce that the NHS relies on. It's also about making Britain an attractive place for British workers, because we're also seeing a lot of medical and nursing staff leaving the country because of the uncertainty and the problems in the NHS. So we need to make it an attractive place to work. We would remove the arbitrary 1% pay cap, and we would reintroduce independent pay review bodies for the NHS, and we would commit to funding the pay awards that were made by the independent bodies. We would reintroduce bursaries for health-related degrees and qualifications, and as Adrian has already said, we would remove tuition fees. So there's a lot of things there for for making the NHS a more attractive place to work and for encouraging staff. But fundamentally, yes, a lot of this is about money.
Okay, let's hear from Chloe Smith. And the question was, what will your party do to ensure the NHS is properly staffed and funded?
Yes, our manifesto is, first of all, absolutely crystal clear that the NHS should remain a service free at the point of use and should be there for the generations to come. We will put further funding into the NHS, and that is on top of the funding we have already been able to do in government. That earlier funding has already been able to bring in north of 10,000 more doctors, similar amount of nurses, and indeed more staff in mental health as well.
Is it enough, though?
Well, so hence we set out in the manifesto that we want to be able to do more. And that money is to cover additional staff and the training associated with it. Buildings, of course, as well. Buildings in some cases are not up to scratch. Technology also needs to be looked at, and that you'll find clear in our manifesto. And finally, also access to drugs and access to new treatments as they emerge. You'll see that also in our manifesto. But the point I would make, and this is about the funding, and I don't know whether Jeremy Corbyn has asked Diane Abbott to do the sums in this particular section of your manifesto. But in all seriousness, what I would say is that you can only do these things if you have a strong and growing economy that allows you to pull those tax revenues into public services. And it'll be nice for the audience to remember as well that the top 1% of earners pay 27% of our income tax. We have got more out of the tax payment of the rich than the Labour government ever did, and you will see again in our manifesto in black and white that we will continue to do so.
Okay, thank you all very much. Rob, let's have another question.
Let's move on. Just before we take another one from the audience, good question on Facebook coming from Fiona. She says, if voted in, how are you going to help the schools? She's a mother of 4, and if you scrap the free school meals, my kids will have to go without food from breakfast until they come home from school. She wants to know about school funding, particularly school meals.
Okay, well, that's a Conservative policy, so let's go back to Chloe Smith. Thank you.
So to Fiona and her question. In our manifesto, you will see, first of all, an additional £4 billion of funding for schools. That is more than a real terms increase for every year of the Parliament to come. Secondly, you will also see a continuation of our work to make the funding formula fairer, so that schools here in Norfolk get the deal that they haven't to date had in comparison to schools in London or Liverpool, for example. In terms of school meals, it was, in fact, a Liberal Democrat policy during the coalition government that said that children, no matter what their parents' income, so even the children of millionaires, should get a free school meal, a free lunch at school. We think that actually it's a better use of money to make sure that the children who need it continue to get their lunch, and perhaps that's Fiona's family, but the poorest children will continue to get their school lunch. In addition to that, we want to use that money more wisely to allow every child to have a breakfast at school, because we know that breakfast sets them up to learn for the day, and there is evidence from educationalists that this could be just as good a use of the money. We think that's better than the earlier policy.
Okay, thank you. We are short on time. I wanted to hear from Hugh on funding for schools and what you would do if you got back into coalition, say.
I think in our manifesto we're talking about 7 billion for schools. I'm not really trying to compete on numbers, but we need to put some more money into schools. Certainly one of the things that we did do in coalition was to introduce the pupil premium, which was a very useful additional payment to support children from disadvantaged backgrounds and the armed forces and other things like that, which has been an enormous success, especially, I would say, in my experience, in Norfolk. An awful lot of primary schools have improved very considerably as a result of it.
Okay, I'm sorry, we are quite short of time. A quick word on education funding and schools funding, if that's okay, Chris.
Yes, two things. The figure you won't hear from Chloe is the per pupil real terms funding, because that is what has been reducing over the last few years and what we have committed to increase. And the other thing is that that a lot of that additional funding in education has been going into the free schools programme and is now earmarked to go into the selective schools programme to reintroduce secondary modern schools.
Okay.
That's what we wouldn't do. I would just say I don't quite understand the Conservative logic that says that it's a bad thing to have universal free school lunches, but it's a good thing to have universal free school breakfasts. Okay. That's also for the children of millionaires.
Okay, all right, thank you. A quick word from the Greens on education funding.
Yes, we restore the cuts to the pupil premium, but also we want to bring back in to local authority control free schools and academies.
All of them?
All of them, and so that we can actually fairly distribute the resources which we're going to put more into, and have a county council which is doing its job it's supposed to do of overviewing the education system and making sure every school in this county is well funded and you know, doing the best for its children.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go back to Rob for another question from the audience, if we may.
We've got a good question here from Robert Chalmers.
When can we expect genuine improvement in the service provided on the railway from Norwich to Liverpool Street? And what's the different priorities as far as the different parties are concerned?
Okay, thank you very much, Robert. So I know this is something you've been working on, Chloe Smith, so let's start with you. When will we see the improvements to that Norwich to London line?
Passengers will be seeing improvements already as trains have been refurbished on that line. The work I've been leading has secured new trains to come, and that's after the currently refurbished ones. So you've got refurbished at present and then new trains which will be coming in the next couple of years. Those will give passengers a faster and more reliable journey. And crucially, what that will do, when you take it together with some other measures, what that will do is bring more jobs to Norwich. This is the reason I've been leading this piece of work, because it will bring thousands more jobs to Norwich for the young people of today and people of the future. That is what we need. We need people to know that it is possible to get to Norwich reliably on the transport we have. That is what the Conservative government has delivered for Norwich, and I have been leading that work here because it is that important.
Okay, thank you. Let's ask Hugh Lanham, Liberal Democrats, Norwich to London line. How important is that to you?
All infrastructure is important, and to link Norwich into the Cambridge-London axis is very important, and we do need to get on with it. And really, infrastructure projects are part of what it takes to get our economy moving, and so it will have two benefits for us.
What would you do differently, though, if you were the MP? What would you do to make it happen?
I've not been involved, so I have to be perfectly honest with you. I don't know. I would have to get involved in that project. I'm not involved in that project. I can't answer the question. Okay. I'm sorry.
All right. Thank you very much. Chris Jones, what about the railways and Labour?
Yes, well, the one thing we would do fundamentally differently with the railways, as you know, is as the franchises came up, we would not renew them and we would take the railways back into public ownership. The evidence that makes a difference is the East Coast Main Line, that was one of the poorest performing franchises. The private sector pulled out. The public sector took it over. It was then the best performing franchise in the entire country, and when that came up for renewal, the one group that was not allowed to bid for that franchise for ideological reasons was the public sector company that was running it. So we've got perfect evidence, a perfect sort of controlled trial, if you like, that public ownership is a better way of running it, and that would work for the vital Norwich link just as it does for all the other railways.
All right, thank you, Dr. Chris Jones. Adrian, the Green Party policy on the railways, how would it make a difference?
Well, yes, we'd bring it back into public ownership in a very similar fashion to as Chris identified. But also, we'd scrap HS2, 42 billion on a single high-speed line. We want more investment in local branch lines. The whole system needs upgrading. We need better connections between Cambridge and Oxford, for instance, and over to the West Country, so you don't have to go via London. But the major thing is we have to get heavy traffic off the road, and we want an investment in commercial rail transport again. So we start using our railways to shift heavy goods across the country, and that's going to save us in terms of carbon emissions, but also generate jobs and, make a proper job of tackling road congestion.
Okay, thank you. Just briefly before we go to another question, a lot of these parties are talking about renationalisation. Why is that a bad idea?
I've always thought that specifically for us in Norwich, this is a bad idea because we have worked so hard to get the franchise now to the point where we've just achieved £1.4 billion of investment. To do Chris's plan now, to do Jeremy Corbyn's plan now, would throw all that away. The answer to the gentleman's original question is that it's taken 10 years to get this kind of investment straight. And I count those 10 years to be from 2014 to 2024. That's the current round, the relevant rounds of investment that we're talking about here. It is no time at all to throw that away and plunge off a cliff all those thousands of jobs that we expect to come to Norwich from this work.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. We don't have an awful lot of time left. I think Rob's got another question from the audience.
Yeah, but very quick last question for the audience. We've got Joe Smith.
How would you propose to tackle the increase in homelessness in Norwich?
All right, nice and short and sweet question. Let's start with Adrian Holmes, shall we? How would you tackle homelessness in Norwich?
Well, for a start, we've got to stop demonising homeless people and not class them as being, again, the undeserving poor. They're out on the street. We need to go out there and help them, get them into secure accommodation. I used to work as a city councillor. I used to deal with a lot of people who had various mental health reasons, which meant they didn't always stay in the first accommodation that you pick for them. We need to put a lot more money into, particularly the health service, to have a proper joined up approach. And also we've got to build more affordable homes. The council's got to build more homes, and we're going to invest in affordable, warm homes.
Okay, let's go to the Liberal Democrats and Hugh.
Yes, it's building homes, but it's also funding our local authorities properly. Again, it's the cuts that have stopped people being able to even have decent bed and breakfast accommodation. It's very often not available now. And yes, some people are on the streets because they have mental health issues, and we're not spending enough on that. We just don't seem, as a society, to spend enough of our energies and resources on caring for people in need.
But it's all got to be paid for, Hugh. How would that happen?
Yes, everything's got to be paid for, but we are living in a society where the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. That sort of inequality is a disgrace. We need to work on it. And that will pay for it.
Okay, all right, thank you. Chris Jones?
Very briefly, two things. We need to reverse the cuts to particularly the charitable sector and to the housing associations that have provided these services in the past, that have seen their budgets slashed in recent years. That's one of the reasons the problem is getting so much worse. The other thing is that you won't solve the homelessness problem until we have more homes. So a key part of Labour's manifesto is stimulating house building, which is good for all parts of the economy, not just in terms of providing homes, but in terms of employment and tax receipts and all of those things. And we've said that 40,000 of the homes that are built will be earmarked specifically for rough sleepers.
Okay, thank you. Just 20 seconds, if you would, Chloe, just a quick answer on homelessness.
So as the local MP, I've supported measures in Parliament which give councils the tools they need to help on this front. There was more announced on this only during this year, February onwards, by this government. In our manifesto are further measures to assist homelessness. And actually, as Chris says, building houses is the crucial part of this. Okay. The greater the supply, the more we can do for all future generations.
Then why haven't we been building any?
Thank you. Thank you all very much. We are almost at the end, but I want to ask all the candidates to tell us in 30 seconds their sort of roundup and to tell us why you should vote for them in this upcoming election. And we'll start with you. In 30 seconds or so, why should people vote for you, sir?
I think we should remember that this election is all about Brexit. It was called about Brexit. And you've got to vote Liberal Democrat to stand any chance, it seems, of saving the single market. You've also got to vote for openness and tolerance and compassion. You've got to vote for a united party that can represent your values and your principles. Vote Liberal Democrat, and remember that if we're getting towards a hung parliament, a Liberal Democrat MP will be a lot more use to you than a tactical vote.
All right, thank you, Hugh. Just 30 seconds, if you would. Chris Jones, why should people vote for you?
I think in this election we are, for the first time in many years, seeing a very clear choice and a clear difference between the visions of the two parties. That is partly about Brexit and about the sort of country we want to be in the future, but more fundamentally than that, it is about the sort of society we want to be and the sort of people we want to be in the future. Do we want the low tax, low welfare, low skill, offshore tax haven economy of the Conservatives, or do we want a fairer, more equal society where everybody is taken care of and nobody gets left behind?
Thank you,
that's the choice, and that's what we have to decide next week.
Thank you very much. Just 30 seconds. Why should we vote for you, Chloe Smith?
There is indeed a very clear choice at this election. there is the leadership requirement to get us through Brexit and beyond. We do need a strong Prime Minister. If you want that strong Prime Minister, you have to vote for her. And if you want a strong local MP that can also carry on getting results for our city, you need to vote for her as well.
Okay, thank you very much. And to finish us off, Adrian Holmes, why should people vote Green?
Well, here and in the rest of the world, we're facing the greatest challenge that mankind's ever faced in terms of global warming. It's going to affect our children and their children more than it is us. We have to look at that and how we're going to work together to do that. We can't do that in a divided society. We cannot work against those big problems, and we have to redistribute wealth. We have to lift people out of poverty. We said we're going to do it. It's the only way. We've got to create a society which wants to work together, where everybody feels it's got a stake in it.
All right, thank you all very much. Thank you to my guests, thank you to the audience, and thank you to you for watching at home. But that is all we've got time for this evening. Good night.